Mm-hmm.
All right, just tell me when.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. So, my research here was looking at the Washington Post police use of deadly force. Now, as you know, starting around 2015, the Washington Post created a data set of police shootings to understand what was going on and specifically look at issues of race and other things. So, and it became at one time the gold standard, and it still is the most completed data set of police use of deadly force, and spoke specifically on shootings. The problem with the data is that it isn't complete, and one of the critiques of the data is that it didn't provide situational context for police using shootings. So what I did is I downloaded the data set and we went back and went through all of the public known information about each shooting and added in situational factors and threat factors, as well as looking at the question of police discriminability. Police discriminability is, can they tell the difference between a cell phone and a gun in somebody's hand under a situation? So basically, we enhanced the Washington Post data set. So we used data from 2015 through 2019, 5 years, to look at what was the situational dynamics going on in police use of force. So now this comes from 2023, and I just took this directly off of the Washington Post data set. So over the last 8 years, you can see the progression of police use of force, and this is of course just dealing with shootings. And so overall the 8 years, the police shoot and kill about 1,010 people a year. And as you can see, it's been a consistent increase from 2017 through 2022. Looking at the issue from race, you can see that over 8 years, on average, 237 blacks are shot and killed by the police, and you can see the pattern thereof. And there has been a beginning of a decrease from 2019 through 2022. Overall, here is the average of police shootings involving blacks. The disproportionality is one of the things that we begin to study. And as you can see, the disproportionality, blacks make up about 13% of the United States population. And about 23, on average, 23% of all police shootings involve African Americans, blacks, but blacks only make 13%. So that is the beginning of the disproportionality. Okay. Now, of course, the point is that disproportionality in of itself, by itself, doesn't really explain. It tells you that there may or may not be a problem. So, as I said, the critique of the data was that it didn't have any situational context, and so that's what this research is. So here's a map one of my colleagues made for me, and this shows the pattern, and these are the top states that have shootings, and as you can see where the clustering is. So we looked at descriptive data first, and the top 3 states that have police shootings is California, Texas, and Florida. And as you can see by the chart here, California, Texas, and Florida are the top 3 states. And then we put together a chart showing the others, and then you have Florida, Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Oklahoma, Ohio, Washington, North Carolina, and then a few others that have more than 100. The rest of the states had less than 100, and so, but this is showing the ones that have significance, and as you can see, here is where we have the concentration, and it's not in the Northeast, it's in the Confederate States, and then the Midwest. So, then we looked at the distribution of shootings by race, And one of the things discovered is that they're not equally distributed. So, in all of the top 10 states, blacks and Hispanics comprise either half or more than half of all police incidents. So, for example, if you look at California, first one on the chart, you look at California. Blacks made up 6.5% of the total population in California, but accounted for 16% of police shooting incidents. Hispanics accounted for 39% of the total population, but 41% of police shootings. Whites accounted for 72% of the total California population, but only accounted for 29%. So, and if you look at all the top states, all of them have the same general result, is that blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be shot by the police than whites by looking at general population. Okay. Yes. Now, if you look at the top 3 cities where shootings are going on, they're Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Houston, and that's how we just counted the top 3 cities. Now, when we compare the cities in a combination of comparing it to race, we found distinctions. The top 3 cities for police incidents use of deadly force shootings for blacks was Chicago, St. Louis, and Houston. But for Hispanics, it was Los Angeles, Phoenix, and San Antonio. And what we did is we compared, as you can see here, these are the top 3 cities by race, and I'm comparing it to general population. And so you can see that for blacks, the top were Chicago, St. Louis, and Houston, and Hispanics, it was Los Angeles, Phoenix, and San Antonio. And so when we also looked at, for whites, it was Phoenix, Austin, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. So one of the things we're already finding with this data is that use of police force shootings is not equal. Once you look at race, it is not equally distributed either by location, and as we go on to another, also by situation. So the heart of the data was looking at the situational analysis, because that's what this data is adding to it, what was going on. So here on this chart, what I have here, starting on this slide, this is what you get when you get the Washington Post data set. And they had whether the person was armed, whether was there a weapon, age, gender, location. But what the data did not show was what was the situational context. And so we went back and we went back and reinvestigated all of those shootings with publicly known information. And so we added 21 situational contexts, 8 threat perception contexts, and whether the police were correct in viewing a weapon being a weapon as opposed to a cell phone or something else. Some of the famous shooting incidents involved where the police thought that the person was grabbing a weapon, and it turned out he was grabbing his wallet, and then they shot him dead. Now, you look at police literature and argument is a whole thing about, under stress and how long a police officer has to determine whether something is a weapon or not. That's a research for another day. What I wanted to know here was, in these shootings, in fact, was the person armed, right? Okay. And then situation, now that was the main thing. We added 21 factors for police incidents to put context to shootings. So, as you can see here on table 7, shows the racial distribution of situational context by race resulting in police use of force. Whites accounted for a plurality of situations resulting in police use of force. In other words, the majority of the incidents involved whites doing something that created a situation police got shot. The only time that African Americans had a plurality of situations was if it was the context of a fight or responding to selling drugs. In these two situations, blacks accounted for the plurality of situations, plurality being in the 40s. So, now, despite political rhetoric, so when we compared situational context to race, to population, to threats, we compared those factors, as you see here. Here's one of the things that we found that was interesting. For example, 50% of all incidents in which a gun was pointed at the police were committed by whites. So the idea that blacks are more threatening to police officers and police officers should have that in their minds, this data showed that is not true. The police were more likely to have a white person pointing a gun at them than somebody who's black and Hispanic. Then, if you looked at all threatening incidents committed by whites, how many of those were pointing a gun at police? And that's 39%. Okay? So whites were more likely to point a gun to be threatening to police, period, and were more likely to be threatening them with a gun than blacks and Hispanics. Because blacks, 23% of all incidents in which a gun was pointed at officers were black. And then when you looked at all incidents threatening police by blacks, pointing a gun was at 36%. They were doing something else, okay? So, whites are more likely to point a gun at police, and of all possible threats to police, pointing a gun at police was more likely to be done by whites. A higher percentage of whites than blacks chose among various threats to police to threaten police with a pointed gun. And within the threat of pointing a gun at police, whites were more likely to do so than blacks. So the idea that when police are confronting blacks as opposed to whites or Hispanics, that blacks are more likely to be armed and pointing guns at them is actually not statistically correct when you look at the situations of police shootings. Now, 50%, about half, 50%, 54% of situations that require police use of force were when they were called for help, when we had a citizen call for help. There was a domestic violence incident, police officers being shot at or resisting arrest. Now, what found significant of this is the narrative is that the police shootings show up because of resisting arrest or threats to police officers. When we looked at that situation, it was less than 10% of all incidents, right? Police were more likely to have to deal with a police shooting if they were responding to a call for help or a domestic violence than somebody shooting at the police officers or resisting arrest. I focus on resisting arrest because that's used politically and rhetorically as a proxy for threats against police officers, resisting arrest. Okay? And that was only when we ranked the situation, it was fourth on the list and only accounted for 9.2%. It is not a significant explanation for police use of force, threats to police officers resisting arrest. Now, traffic stops ranked sixth on the list of incidents resulting in the use of deadly force, right? But it was fifth among blacks and 12th among whites. Once we ranked the situation by race, distinctions began to show up, okay? Resisting arrest was fourth among blacks and 10th among whites. For example, within the situational context of possible suicide, so here is where, in this chart, here is where we rank the situational context by race, by the percentage within race, right? So, for example, within the situational context of possible suicide, whites accounted for 80% of the cases. We're responding to a welfare check that resulted in police use of deadly force. 58% resulted in killing of whites. But more significant in the fact is that the top three situations in Table 10, as you see for whites, are not in the top 3 situations for blacks and Hispanics. So what we kept finding was there was a divergence when you put race to situation, which situations were resulting in deadly force. It was different depending on race. So, for blacks, the top 3 situations that resulted in police use of deadly force was police responding to a report of a person selling drugs, a fight, or some other incident. For Hispanics, the issue was home invasion and responding to robbery. Now, traffic stops. Now, one of the reasons we focus on traffic stops is because that's the whole thing of driving while black and the talk, right? So I was particularly interested in how traffic stops work comparing whites to blacks, right? So traffic stops accounted for accounted for the 5th highest percentage of incidents resulting in deadly force for blacks, but it was 12th for whites. So blacks are more likely to be shot in traffic stops than whites. Same situation. Okay. Now, while it's true that whites made up the majority or plurality of all police use of force, certain situations were more likely to result in deadly force, and with those situations whites compared to blacks. Blacks are more likely to be shot by police in traffic stop and police calls for drugs and resisting arrest situation than whites when looking at the distribution of percentages involving race. And that's what I have in this chart here. So, finishing out, we want to look at discriminability. When the police say the person was armed, were they right? Now, Fourth Amendment analysis, having a gun or not having a gun is not determinative, right? It's totality of the circumstances and it's a whole kind of thing. But I wanted to just see if when they said that the person was armed, were they correct, right? Okay, our research found that 88% of time, police officers were indeed correct, okay? That the person that they said was armed actually was. But when looking at when they were wrong, how did that work out by race? When they were wrong, how did that work out by race? And so, as you can look in this chart here on table 12, the police, when the police were wrong, for whites, they were wrong 8.7, within race of whites, they were wrong 8.7%. Within blacks, they were wrong 11.2%. Hispanics, they were wrong 8.9%. Point being that when the police were correct, right? They were correct in 88% of, overall 88% of time, which was also the percentage of when they were right in dealing with blacks. The problem is that when you look at race, they were correct 91%, well, all other races. So the police are more likely to be wrong when dealing with blacks than dealing with whites and Hispanics and Asians, right? They were correct 88% of the time with blacks, which is also the overall average of them being correct. But 88% is lower than the 91% when they were correct with all other races. So they were more likely to be wrong when they were dealing with blacks, which supplements and supports the other research with police talking about how they react to African Americans and threats, where they're more likely, with the push button research, they're more likely to be wrong with blacks than wrong with anybody else. And looking at actual incidents, the push button data proved to be correct. So in looking at the nature of police interaction when the police had to determine if the suspect was armed, as shown in 19, the top 4 situations in which the police were wrong were not equally distributed. When you look, so now I want to see, okay, when they were wrong, what situations were they wrong in? Okay, when they were wrong, what situations were they wrong in? Okay, well, while resisting arrest was in the top 4 situations with all races, police showed less error by race with Hispanics than whites than with blacks. So when they were wrong, they were more wrong in traffic stops with blacks. Okay? So there's a racial dynamic going on in the shootings, even when you factor in when they were wrong about whether the person was armed or not. Okay. Blacks and Hispanics had traffic stops within the top 4 incidents in which police were wrong regarding the presence of a weapon. And within that situation, the error rate by race, blacks was 15%, Hispanics was 11.6%, and then white error was 10.2%. So when you look at traffic stops, police wrong, race, the police were more likely to be wrong with blacks at 15% than whites at 10%. So this comes back to supporting the idea of the talk and the idea that traffic stops are more dangerous for blacks than whites, looking at, first, more blacks are generally shot in those situations, and when they are shot wrong because they thought there was a weapon, more likely to be black than whites and Hispanics. So, conclusion, majority of police incidents are not threats to police officers, right? Attacks on police officers resisting arrest are in the bottom. Blacks are more likely to be shot in situations in which the police were called for selling drugs, a fight, accident, or resisting arrest. But whites are more likely to be for suicide by cop, welfare checks, which was something I didn't expect to find, welfare checks, and responding to home invasion. Okay, just to finish out, I just want to point one thing out also. I wasn't going to do this, but we have a couple of minutes. Let me just finish this. So, benchmarking. That is a real big deal in criminal justice in looking at police use of force. So, I looked at 3 of the benchmarks that tend to be. Now, we generally tend to use population to show disproportionality. Okay. But I also looked at National Crime Victimization Survey, FBI UCR, and Bureau of Justice incarceration, okay? So, make long story short, this is victim surveys about violent crime. This is FBI violent crime. This is incarceration violent crime, 2017, 18, 19, okay? Now, if I was in class, I'd play with this, but I'm just gonna work the answer for you. Okay, then. Look at these bars by race. Right? Hispanic, white, black. So when we use National Crime Victimization Survey as a proxy for violent crime behavior, right? Because this includes all violent behavior that's not attached to arrest. So they say this one is a more reflective, okay? All right then. So taking the proxy for what we say it means, okay, right? Blacks make up 24% of all violent crime. All right. We use FBI data, FBI arrest data for a proxy of violent crimes committed. Right? Now that's actually not what it is, but let's take the proxy for what it is. Okay. So let's take it, and it's 37%. Okay. Locked up. These are people that we know guilty. Right? That's what we use the data for. Right? Okay. Then. 61%. Okay. Notice the pattern in each year, 17, 18, 19. You have an elevated fact. So blacks are responsible for 24% of the violent crime, but they make up 37% of the arrests. But they make up 61% of people incarcerated for violent crime. Okay. That elevation is true for everybody except whites. Somehow, when we look at, now, people want to use each one of these as a benchmark to basically assert, yes, African Americans are more involved in police shootings because they're more violent. All right. But when you compare these 3 benchmarks, the racial problem shows up. That's why I argue that these benchmarks shouldn't even be used. Because how did you go from whites accounting for 49% of the violent crime and 50% of the arrests and drop to 47 of the convictions? Obviously, something is not working and is spread over each 3 years. Each 3 years, that's the same elevation. My argument would be that, one, when you put these three benchmarks together, the systemic racial issues in criminal justice show up, and that invalidates them as a proper benchmark. I think the better benchmark is situational analysis of police shootings. And I'll show this is just a different chart showing patterns of crime if you take the benchmarks for what we want to say they actually mean, right? So whites made up 2,311 of police shootings, and then 46% of the shootings, and they make up 76% of the population, 69% of the violent crime, 50% of violent behavior, 48% of incarcerations, and as you can see, whites are undercounted in events, and African Americans are disproportionately accounted for. So I would argue to begin with, these should be used as benchmarks. But if you're going to use them as benchmarks, realize you put them together, you see the systemic racial disparities within our system, and I think it invalidates them as a proper benchmark. Thank you very much.